Good. So good evening, formally. Good evening to the web audience, to the millions of you out there. Hundreds of millions and billions. And being that we don't know the mysteries of the universe, who knows where it's being beamed to and who's picking up signals from Earth. So that's part of the mysteries of the infinite power of the digital age, where information is being translated into digital zeros and ones, and in turn being distributed all over the universe, solar systems. So it feels good to try to make a footprint in existence, let's put it that way. Now, in Judaism, in Torah, there's a concept called different types of words one speaks. There's considered you can speak something of content that has some personal meaning and helps people improve the welfare of their lives. Or you can speak about something which in Hebrew is called dvarim b'telim, which means empty words that have no benefit. It's an interesting exercise to see in an average day how many words we speak that benefit somebody and how many words we speak that really have no meaning and insignificant. I'm not even talking about words that are hurtful and painful, but even words that just simply don't bear any fruit. So hopefully my words here will try to bear, I'll attempt to plant some words that will bear some fruit. And I see the dissemination of information as like we're all links in the chain, and truth is not, no one has a monopoly on the truth. Truth is something that's within all of us, but sometimes it's concealed, and sometimes we're distracted. So a good teacher, a good inspiration is someone that's able to uncover the inner truths that resonate within all of us. And if we all are links in a chain, then that is what we call the ripple effect of real knowledge, passed on from generation to generation, from person to person, where we all are part of, as they say, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So part of the solution being that we all pass on some truths to our children, our families, our friends, and if we all made a little effort in that direction, I am sure the world would be a better place. So that being said, I just will give a small introduction to this class for the benefit of those that have not been here before and also online, as well as for those that have been here. Now, I grew up in a traditional Jewish home, which you may be able to see from my look. And at the same time, however, my father was a journalist, so I grew up in a very open-minded home. It had no tinge of what is known as religious dogma, which someone preaching to you or in a condescending or judgmental fashion, a particular set of rituals. I grew up, as I said, with traditions, but it was a very open-minded home, discussions. My parents were well-read, and I was always we always had the freedom to think and freedom to ask questions, which, I don't know each of you where you grew up in homes, but often in homes doesn't necessarily mean religious homes, but there are times in homes you grew up where you're not allowed to be independent, and it's not necessarily cultivated. It's either your parents' way or the only way, and you can't challenge and so on, which of course is what creates why most people in this world are conformists in the first place. So thank God, as I said, I grew up in a home where a certain type of independence, a certain type of a free inquiry was encouraged, which was extremely helpful and healthy for my soul, at least, because I by nature am a skeptic, and I do not take well to being commanded or preached to. And as I went through my own journey in my teenage years and searching and trying to explore, I had the privilege, I had the benefit of having a pretty intense Jewish education, so I wasn't beginning from a point of ignorance, but it didn't necessarily have resonance or relevant to me. I saw the Torah and Jewish thought as being definitely comprehensive, and you have people of the book, besides the Bible, the Talmud, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of books of Jewish literature Jews are always writing, and we're always scribes, and we're always documenting and commenting and arguing. And the whole classic body of the corpus of Torah scholarship and Jewish scholarship is quite formidable. Most people are actually not even aware of the amount of books there are, and are still in manuscripts and continuing to be published. But it's not a surprise, because the fact is, for example, the Constitution of the United States, many people aren't aware, is really based mostly on Talmudic law. And the Talmud is an extremely extensive and, as I said, comprehensive body of legal arguments, back and forth and counter-arguments. So that I was exposed to. But the challenge was, me personally, and then I realized was not only my own, but a challenge that all of us face, is the key word, an operative word, is relevance. Is it relevant to us? You know, it's one thing, how many people really read for example, a contract? Or how many people read a mortgage? You know, you rely on your lawyers to read the fine print. So maybe it's important for security and for protecting your rights and so on and so forth. But legalities alone do not make necessarily a spiritual dynamic system. And that's one of the challenges I faced was, what's the relevance? You read these biblical stories, and then you understand as I said, the arguments and the counter-arguments and the commentaries, which are just a multitude of books and pages and commentaries and scholars. And relevance sometimes seems to be lacking. Not just sometimes, very often. And which is therefore not a surprise why membership in synagogues and attendance in synagogues continues to wane. And because something's not relevant, people drop out. How long can you do something just out of guilt or out of superstition or just for social purposes? People searching for meaning and purpose, if you can't find it in your own tradition, look elsewhere. 60% of Buddhists in America are Jewish. 60. So that sounds like a big number, but the fact is because Jews are seekers, and when they don't find it in their own tradition, you look elsewhere. So that was my challenge, and I guess I was blessed, because even though I guess everybody gets credit for a little what you do, but I was in the right place in the right time. And I was exposed also to the Kabbalistic and mystical teachings, which ultimately really what exposed me to a whole new understanding and appreciation of all these ideas. And I came to realize, as we all come to realize at some point in our lives, that existence in general consists of a body and a soul. And when you look at the body of something, a body, the outside layer, can be very dry, hollow, and irrelevant. But when you understand the spirit of it and the deeper inner meaning of it, then suddenly it becomes significant. And not only significant, it can change your entire life. I mean, just to put it in scientific terms, in a way you can sum up all the whole pursuit of knowledge and truth, and the scientific pursuit is really about discovering the forces that are invisible, that make the world tick, that make us tick. And when we begin to discover those forces, we come to realize that the universe is like an integral unit of each piece being interdependent on everything else. So if you go with a very primitive and superficial look, we live in a world, a very fragmented universe, and without any knowledge, what relationship is there between us and the millions or hundreds of millions of trees growing in a forest, or the different species all over the universe? But through scientific research and through exploration and through intensive trial and error, cumulative knowledge through the generations, we come to discover that's not the case. That we realize today that every piece of the universe affects the rest of it. If there was no photosynthesis, for example, in the woods and the forests of this world, we would not be able to. There would be no oxygen. And if the seas in any way are somewhat compromised, it in turn affects the climate, and the climate affects one part of the world. I mean, in other words, even though at the surface level, a child would look and say it's one big large universe and one piece doesn't have any connection to the next, the answer is that's not the case. When you understand the deeper forces, the forces that are not visible to the naked eye, you come to realize, and I'll use the word soul, when you see the soul of the universe, as opposed to its body, the outer layer, you come to realize there's a whole other world, there's another relation, another dimension that does connect things. And the same is true in our own personal lives. God blesses us and our lives are peaceful and we're comfortable and we don't have to deal with too much anxiety. We may not need to dig deeper. But the fact of the matter is, we all realize in our lives at some point, whether it's through a traumatic experience, a loss, or even a joyous experience, that what you see is not what you get. That when I look at you and you look at me, we only see the outer layer. You have no clue of all my experiences in life, what I've gained and what I've lost, and the same with yourself, because we carry it within us, whether you call it the psyche, or the soul, or the spirit, or the memory. The semantics aren't relevant here. The bottom line is there are forces at work that are beneath the surface. And those are invisible and cannot be accessed quite with the same tools that we access so-called outer reality. There's that famous analogy of, who is it, that was one of the physicists of the beginning of the early 20th century. And he writes, so he was asked questions when quantum mechanics was being discovered, and it's all its bizarre conclusions that different physicists were coming to. So he was asked, how do you come to all these so-called counterintuitive ideas when nobody has ever seen an atom, let alone a subatomic particle? And he gave this brilliant and simple analogy of a fisherman that spread his net across all the seas. And then he came up with different types of fish. There's different sizes, different colors, different shapes, different species. And he documented it all. And then he came out with his brilliant thesis, his brilliant innovation. Conclusion was that there are no fish in the sea that are shorter than a half-inch long. That was his great discovery. Until his little child asked him a simple question, like the emperor with no clothes type of question, which was, let me see your net. And he looked at the net. The net had spaces of half-inch spaces between one string and the next. So obviously, all the fish that were shorter than a half-inch long fell back into the sea. So his conclusion was very correct, but he just had to qualify with one short statement by saying, when you use a net, an instrument that has half-inch spaces, you'll never catch fish in the sea that are shorter than a half-inch long, which obviously upsets his whole premise in the first place. But very often, we make mistakes not in our conclusions, but in our assumptions. If you define your assumptions, you often see that the assumption may be wrong. So your conclusion is correct, but if you trace it back to the root may be the problem. And this is very common, very, very common, because we all have assumptions. And we all have assumptions. Some of them are correct assumptions, some are not correct. Some are stereotypes. Some are things someone told us and we never challenged. And not even maliciously. There are assumptions that all of us have that we just take for granted, and then one day you suddenly think to yourself and say, 1 second, who said that's a fact in the first place? And we make build all kinds of equations and postulates and all kinds of conclusions based on an assumption that was not necessarily correct. Or maybe it was correct for another situation or another person, another time, another generation. So Torah thought really ultimately is about getting to the root as opposed to the symptoms, and trying to understand what makes us tick. What are the inner workings of the universe, and what are the inner workings of the soul? And in essence, you could say, well, isn't that psychology? Yes, it's exactly correct. But the word psychology is just 100 years old. And the Torah was talking psychology thousands of years ago. So Freud was not the first psychologist in existence. Yes, he was Jewish. He had a Jewish mother. But his Jewish mother also had a Jewish mother. And somewhere, it goes back all the way to Eve, the first Jewish mother. And psychology existed since human beings exist. Because psychology really is the understanding of the psyche, is understanding of the unconscious, of the soul. And as I began to discover in my teen years, reading mysticism and Kabbalistic texts, I realized all these things are documented. And not in one page. Thousands and thousands of pages that talk about the inner spirit behind the whole story. And the more I read, the more fascinating it was, the more relevant it was. And you could say, if you want to put it in a formula, you can say, the more inward you travel, the more relevant things become to your life. The more superficial, more outer, the less relevant they'll be. Let's just use a simplistic example. As I mentioned before, trees in the forest. So you look at a tree. You take your child the first time they ever see a tree. Okay? And your child says, okay, it's a nice tree. What does that have to do with my life? So being the child has never seen what a tree can do and doesn't know the properties of a tree, and you as an adult will explain, well, several things. First of all, as I mentioned before, photosynthesis. Even as the tree is growing wherever it may be in the world, it has a function. It's absorbing carbon dioxide. It's releasing oxygen. Then there's cross-pollination. I mean, you can go into a whole thing of what a tree or all the trees accomplish. And then, of course, a tree can be chopped down. I'm not now advocating chopping trees or not chopping. This is not about the greening of the world or not. I'm just mentioning it as an example. You have to qualify everything. You never know who's listening. But you can chop down a tree, or you can break off a branch. And now wood has certain properties that when you understand its use, wood can be used to build something. You can build a table, a chair, a house. Wood has other uses. When it's really broken down, it becomes paper. We would have no paper today if there were no wood. Wood can be used in the stove and can turn into fuel and energy. Just some examples. So if you just look at the naked eye, at the naked tree, all that, the tree has no relevance to your life, has no connection to you, because you're just looking at it at a very surface level. But as soon as you begin to say, one second, the tree may have some more force, has properties, has a personality, has elements in it. And those elements are what expose and show you that it can be made to use and better improve life. As I said, with paper, we're able to now write on paper, we're able to publish books, and so on and so forth. So there's a deeper look at everything will always expose its relevance. So for example, we're here to just use another example, a little deeper example. The Baal Shem Tov, the great Hasidic master we celebrate this year, we honor his 250th yahrzeit, passing. So he was the founder of the Hasidic movement. So one of his teachings was the concept that there are no accidents in life, and that God leads the footsteps of a person, which means if two people encounter each other, it doesn't matter what their intentions are. They may think that they're meeting for business purposes or for entertainment purposes, or just randomly, a random encounter, they bump into each other on a subway or wherever it may be, or any other ostensible reason that they have an encounter. So Baal Shem Tov says that's when you look at the surface level. But if you look at the inner forces at work, there's some deeper reason why these two people had to meet. And if they take advantage of the opportunity, something great can come out for each of them. And that was an attitude that he taught his students, that wherever you go and whoever you meet, always look for the deeper reasons. That doesn't mean you can't have any outer reasons. It doesn't mean that there can be many benefits on many levels. But never ignore the possibilities, the unexpected stuff. Which on a basic level, think of it this way. Every time you travel somewhere, always keep your eyes open. You may have your plans and God may have other plans. And sometimes great things can come out of it. You may meet somebody that has the right answer that you were looking for that moment. You may meet someone that becomes a friend that can be a lifesaver later. I mean, the list goes on. There are many situations. I'll just give you an example. I shared it here. It happened almost 10 years ago. I was driving to East Hampton for a weekend for Shabbos. And it was a weekend lecture that I was giving on that Friday night. And I was driving on Friday afternoon. I'm driving, and I stopped at a gas station to fill up my car. And then the gas station was right near a nightclub. And they were already preparing for some party that night. And there was a guy there, like an attendant, who was also parking cars, like a parking attendant. Some hick town in Long Island. I don't even remember where it was. And he comes over to me, asks me if I'm staying for the party. So I said, I'd love to, but I have another engagement, And he starts asking me, like, what do I do and who am I? I was friendly, I said I just stopped for gas. I told him I'm a writer, I teach. He asked me what I teach, what I write. I told him a summary of little what I do. spiritual stuff, psychological stuff. So he asked me if he can get any of this material. So I said, yeah, if you give me your email address, I'll be happy to send you. I send out a weekly thought every week. I'll send it to you. So I took his email address, and that was it. Anyway, years passed, at least 5 years, maybe more, maybe 6 years. Around 3 or 4 years ago, I get an email from him, middle of nowhere. And he says, you may not remember me, but I met you 6 years ago, whatever the amount it was, I don't remember the exact time. But I met you many years ago. I was working as a parking attendant, and you had stopped, and I'd give you my email address, and you've been sending me your weekly emails. And I have to tell you that your emails have saved my life, have changed my life, and saved my life. He says, I'm Jewish, you probably didn't know that, which I didn't, and I didn't ask him, And he says, I'm completely unaffiliated. I lost my parents at a young age. I've been wandering around from place to place, just looking for jobs. Now thank God, he said he was very settled. He was becoming more successful. And he says, your emails have become my connection. I wait for them every Thursday night. And this is what I pray with. This is my Sabbath. This is my Yom Kippur. This is my Rosh Hashanah. And he knew it all. He's given me a whole list of things that he does. He learned it all from the emails. He says he doesn't go anywhere else. And I was pretty blown away. I wasn't shocked or surprised, but it's interesting, things that usually don't happen like that, and someone tells you. And I realized the truth of that Baal Shem Tov's statement. Not that I had dismissed. I definitely put them on the email and I sent them, but I didn't realize how little things, you never know what you say to somebody, and something, especially today's technology. If there was no email, I'd have to mail them things, and then it's a mailing thing. The whole distribution is very hampered. But I realized how the power of email. Of course, everyone realizes the power of email. Most of us use it for our own personal reasons, business, and so on. But to actually change a person's life spiritually and emotionally, how many people think of it that way? And I saw the power of it. After that, let me tell you, wherever I go, everyone I meet, right away, I'm always collecting emails. I don't try to come on hard, but I just say, if you have an email, I'll send it to you. Because I realized, and then I've always said to people, look, people say, what can I really do? I meet someone on a plane or this and this. So you could always send them something. You could always send them a nice thought that you received. And if you don't have your email, you could forward by my email if you like. It doesn't matter. Or find something else. It's just interesting how we can, with small little actions and a shift in consciousness that's not so focused on me, but also on what can come out of benefiting another person in an encounter, how things can change. And it doesn't compromise whatever benefit you may get from it. This is all an example of when you look at the soul of things. So here I drove by a gas station. It was just an incidental thing. I just happened to need gas. Why would I think that I'm going to meet a guy at a gas station that something can come out of it? But when you start thinking that there's maybe a deeper script to our lives, an inner script, things we don't see. It's like seeing the forest from the trees. Then it's also an act of humility. You don't have it all figured out. You may know one part of the script, but there's maybe a deeper script. And it's an extremely transformative way of looking at life, because number one, it helps you ride through even difficult times, because you realize there's more to the picture. And even good times, you don't just indulge in something because it makes you feel good. You realize there's always more to the story. And that type of more, the deeper dimension, is a tremendous way of looking at life, because it also helps you look at your own possibilities and realize that, just because you have certain perception of yourself, that doesn't mean that's the end of it all. There may be a lot more to your life, more potential, more opportunities. It's just a whole other way of not being trapped in your own assumptions, as I mentioned, and your own perceptions. And it requires humility at times, because we all have our comfort zones, and requires a way of stepping deeper into a picture. And this is true across the board. And I counsel many people. Relationships, of course, is a number one topic. Relationships. People look for relationships, looking for healthy relationships. And relationships is if anything needs a soul, a relationship needs one. Because a relationship cannot, you can have a superficial relationship with your grocer maybe, or with even a business associate. But the person that you're supposed to be loving, or wants to love you, and you want to love them, love is never going to be sufficient just to do it superficially. Because the soul, the spirit, needs more than just someone taking out the garbage. It needs more than just a companion that goes to a party with you. It needs more than just having someone you can speak to. it gets into life, it gets into all our strengths and weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, intimacy, and really our soul and our psyche. So in relationships, if we're living on a life that is very superficial on an outer level, the first thing that will suffer will be our relationships. The next thing that will suffer will be our children. Basically, anything that thrives on soulful communication and experience will suffer when you don't satisfy it. It's not being nurtured, it's not being nourished. All this is somewhat of an introduction. But like it is with Jews, it goes always like this. Every introduction is an introduction to the next introduction. And there, in that context, nothing is an introduction, if you know what I mean. Everything becomes an end in itself. You never know what it is that you say that is going to have an impact on someone. But since this class officially has some focus, there was a time many years ago when I was teaching this class where literally we would come together and I would just say, what do you have on your mind today? Because I believed in this spontaneous. But then as the classes grew, more people, it became a little unwieldy and chaotic. So I was forced to conform to the normal procedure of identifying a topic for a class. So I apologize for having to do that, create focus. I don't know, some people like focus, some don't. What can I say? So that being said, there is a focus theme for this evening, which is, I could say, is what I just shared with you is a springboard to that topic. And that is something I usually try to take something from the weekly portion that we read and translate it and apply it in relevant terms. As I said, in spiritual, psychologically relevant terms that has some meaning to our own challenges and the struggles and issues that we humans in the 21st century, the dawn of the 21st century, are dealing with. So I decided to choose a particular interesting, fascinating story in this chapter, which is pretty well known, but nevertheless it's still a very quite cryptic story, even though most of us know the fairy tale part of it. And that is the story of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel. So just to read a few verses here, if I may, and translate. So the end of this chapter, Noach, this is the second chapter in the book of Genesis. After the high holidays, we begin reading the Torah anew. And when you read it, the biblical stories of the Garden of Eden, of Exodus from Egypt have become pretty popularized. You have movies and films and cartoons based on them, Ten Commandments, Prince of Egypt. I mean, many stories, many novels, many books and movies and films and so on, poems have been written based on biblical narratives. But and the Tower of Babel is also one of them. Songs have been written about Babylon, about the confusion of Babylon, the Tower of Babel. But I thought to touch upon one particular, at least intrigued me, and I think is quite a relevant theme once you begin to realize the deeper meaning of it. So the technical story, let's start with the technical, the body, and then we'll go to the soul. The body of the story is that, and to read here just a few verses, I'll just give you the text of it. This is a story that happens after the great flood, the great biblical flood. So it says like this, that the entire world spoke one language and were united in one language. They traveled to the east and they found a very big an area to settle, where they said this is like Mesopotamia, which is essentially around, say, southeastern Iraq of today. That's the area that we're talking about, which is generally the beginning of Genesis, and the biblical story is all around that area. Garden of Eden is all around southern Iraq, some modern-day southern Iraq. So Iraq is still in the news, all the way from then. Okay, Iraq would later be Babylon, Persia, which is Iraq, Iran, but that area, these are the early empires. So they settled in this valley. And then it continues and says, this also is the first documentation of people building structures. So it talks about the technology of how they develop the brick. Bricks. Brick, of course, is not, bricks don't grow anywhere. Bricks are a combination. It's a man-made item that's made out of stone and combining with other things and cement. So here they take these bricks, which they burned. In those days, bricks were burned. I think today as well, but they did it probably in a different way then. And they said, let us build. This is the exact language here. Let us build a city.
And then let us build a tower, and the tower should rise through to heaven. And we will make for ourselves a name, so we shall never be forgotten from the face of this earth. This is the way the Torah describes it. Then it continues. It says God descends to look at this tower that they're building, and he doesn't like what he sees. And these are God's words. Here's a nation, here's a people who all speak the same language, which means they communicate with each other. And what's the first thing they think of doing is building a tower to make a name for themselves. And because they're united, nothing can really stop them. And then God continues, so what I will do is, we will confuse their language, that they will not be able to speak to each other, because they're all speaking the same language. And once they can't communicate, they won't be able to plan together and plot. And that's what happens. God confuses their language, and from then on, this place is called Babylon. Because in Hebrew, Bavel, like Babel, when we say someone babbles, Babylon comes from the root right here, Bavel, of confusion, like babbling. And they began speaking to you, they couldn't understand each other. And as a result, they had to all separate and go their each way. And this is, according to the Bible, the birth of languages, the birth of diverse languages. That's the story. I didn't read every word, but that's the basic thing. Now, if you think about it, from beginning to end, doesn't make any sense. What's going on here? First of all, what exactly was the intention of these people? What's wrong with trying to build a tower to heaven? And what's wrong with making a name for yourself? Okay, you could say it's somewhat arrogant, but I mean, is it the biggest crime? They're not killing each other. They're not murdering. You know, the flood came as a result of robbery, rape, crime, and so on. But here, what are they doing already? And then God's response is also very strange. Now, God has to confuse their languages. He wants to destroy the tower. There are many ways to destroy the tower. He just showed that he can destroy a world through a flood. Why does he have to confuse their language? He can just send a lightning and it'll destroy the tower. And what is this whole thing with the birth of languages and diversity and so on and so forth? So it's quite a cryptic story. As I said, it's become popular, the Tower of Babel. People talk about the Tower of Babel. There are images, there are paintings made of the Tower of Babel. And there's a lot of poetry behind it. Obviously, there's deeper meaning to this. This is obviously a deeper story because it begs all these questions. There's no obvious answer. So, to translate like in more contemporary terms, it struck me that there was a contemporary artist in the late 60s, and now I'm talking about 1960s, not back then, just to move the clock forward, who used an expression that's very similar to this expression. And his name was none other than Jimi Hendrix. So yeah, you probably never heard a comparison of Jimi Hendrix and biblical texts, but here you have it. Jimi Hendrix, in a classic song of his, which captured a generation, and still many are still mystified by, besides his guitar abilities, but his lyrics as well, where he has a line, I forgot the name of his song, you probably, the trivia committee, headed by Mark, will let us know. Excuse me while I kiss the sky. This is a line in one of Hendrix's classics. So which song, Mark? Yeah. Anyway. And it was a very powerful line because it captured the you could say the search and the desperate search of so many people, especially in that time, the 60s, but also today and also before him and after him, which was people wanted to kiss the sky. Now, what does it mean to kiss the sky? Obviously, it doesn't mean literally. It means the search for transcendence, the ability to get something, some piece of heaven. When we say we search for heaven, we want to have some heaven in our lives. Piece of heaven, a piece of Eden. You know, you have the books and the writings of East of Eden and the search for Eden, paradise. So, excuse me while I kiss the sky is a type of search, and it's very similar because that's exactly what they say. Let us build a tower, v'reishe b'shamayim, that reaches into heaven, that kisses the sky. And in a sense, it captures the theme that each of us searches for some type of transcendence. Let's define transcendence. Transcendence, as the word implies, transcend. We all are bogged down most of our lives by our mundane, menial, day-to-day, tedious activities. We have to make ends meet, to pay our bills, work, eating, sleeping. Just a third of our lives we're asleep. And then probably another third, without getting to the exact numbers, we're busy with the means. We need to go shopping. To go shopping, you have to commute. To commute, you have to prepare yourself. When it comes down to it, you think how much time is left for your soul, for you, for your inner and deeper needs. Very little time. Almost no time. And then when you add into the equation dysfunctionality and psychological scars and ghosts and skeletons that we all carry, that occupy a serious part of our minds, our psyches, and our thoughts, and so on. There's not only no time, there's a lot of negative time. But yet, every one of us, a human being by nature, searches for something more than just survival. That's how it is. As much as we envy animal bliss, we'll never be satisfied with animal bliss. I think about it. I always have the image in my mind. I remember driving, more than once. I'm sure you've all driven through the country. And suddenly you pass these meadows, and you see these peaceful cows grazing in the meadows. So once I decided to stop and check it out, just stop at the side of the road. And I'm observing the cow, and I'm looking for some action here, some drama. And nothing happens. The cow has no therapy appointments, just can sit and graze through the day after day, eating, breeding, giving birth, dying, protecting its young. It's pretty simple, like a clock. There's no neurosis, there's no arguments, maybe once in a while, but I didn't notice any. When I was in Israel, actually, I remember taking my children to a zoo. In Israel, there's a zoo. I don't mean the people, the zoo. I mean there's actual animal zoo. In Ramat Gan, there's a very famous zoo. Gan Chayot, they call it in Hebrew. So I remember taking my little kids, and we came there was a gorilla cage, 2 gorillas. And on the plaque, it was an outdoor area, with a high fence, so they couldn't get out. And the plaque said in Hebrew, I'll translate, the plaque said that these 2 gorillas, since they've been taken into captivity 24 years ago, they're angry at each other. They don't speak to each other. That's what it said on the plaque. It was quite funny. So I told my kids what it said. So my son, who's a mischievous little guy, at that point, still mischievous, now he's a little older, he's getting married soon, he starts throwing a branch at the gorilla. Because he sees that the female gorilla is sitting all puffed up in one corner, and the male there. My son threw a branch toward the female gorilla from outside. She thought the male gorilla threw it. So she jumped up, started grunting. And I was thinking, for 24 years she's been doing this. And then you see the male keeps trying to get her attention. And it was amazing to me. We couldn't stay there too long, but that's what it said there, 24 years. They don't, so you could assume that it'll remain that way. So that's the only time I actually saw in the animal kingdom a conflict that lasted more than a few minutes, So, but that's not the common situation. I guarantee you that these gorillas probably developed this based on the humans that they observed, because animals know their place. It's only humans that you have these 2 old guys in an old nursing home. They were the best friends for 70 years of their lives. Now they don't speak to each other. And someone says, you don't have that much longer to live. Might as well make up. So the guy says, no, if I say anything to him, he'll think he was right. So that's that. Humans have their ways. So here you have the animal bliss, and it just goes about its own way, whereas we have our own complications. At the same time, animals don't search for transcendence. They don't search for transcendence. they are satisfied with their role. They don't waver from it. So they don't waver, they don't go down, and they don't go up. They keep the balance. We have the opportunity, possibility to both be destructive and to be very constructive. We can go out of the script both ways, to be much worse than our natures or to be much better than our natures. That's the human being. There's a story they tell of, it was one of the great Rebbes when he was a young child. He was playing on a ladder with other children. And all the children were afraid to climb to the top of the ladder, but he wasn't. This little boy climbed all the way to the top. He had the courage. Later, his grandfather asked him, so what distinguished you from the others? Why were you the only one that had that courage to climb all the way to the top? So he said, very simple, Zayd. Zayd in Hebrew is grandpa. He said, because the other children, as they were climbing, they kept looking down. So they saw how high they were. They got scared, frightened. So they scampered down. When I was climbing, I kept looking up. I saw how low I was, so I wanted to go higher. Now you can imagine, a little boy answers that question, he's going to turn into something. And he did. And that is really, in a way, the two choices that people have in their lives. I would say we do both. We have two voices within us. We have the voice of survival, where we're looking down, we're looking around, and you'll see, when you're around people that are less accomplished than you, it'll always bring you down a notch or two, because you could always say, your ego always says, hey, look how much I've done compared to them. But when you're around people who've accomplished more than you, it will always create a certain type of envy, in a positive way even, motivation. Because you say, hey, look at what they've accomplished, look how little I have. So we have the two options, and we have really two voices. One voice in us is like more of the survival part, where we survive. But there's another voice in each of us that seeks transcendence, that seeks to get out of our patterns, our routines. And we do so many different ways. Some of us do it through books, through romance, through music, through art, through literature, through travel, sometimes through healthy ways, sometimes not such healthy ways. A human being seeks relief from the routine, from the monotony of life. And as we seek that relief, we sometimes get to a point we will do anything to relieve ourselves. And that's perhaps why people become addicted to things. Not perhaps, but that's the reason why we become addicted. No one wants to be addicted. No human being with a healthy dignity wants to be dependent on something that controls their lives. So what is it? How can we become addicted? Because we are desperate for relief, and we'll grab it with every ounce of energy. And even if it's coming from a place that's not healthy, but the desperation for the relief from the monotony is so powerful that we can allow ourselves to fall into very dark places. So the worst enemy a human being can have is really monotony, is boredom. And if you don't have something to fill the vacuum that's healthy, something unhealthy is going to fill it. It's always the case. So whenever you see a problem with anyone that in anything, you have to always look at the root, not at the symptom. Yeah, the symptom may be the immediate problem, and you need a Band-Aid, you need whatever it takes to stem the bleeding, and get out of the line of fire. But to solve a problem of that nature, you need to get to the root. If you don't fill the vacuum in a person's life with something healthy, something unhealthy will fill it. So the search for transcendence, or in Hendrix's words, kissing the sky, or in the words of this week's chapter, is the search to touch heaven. So that only, in a way, amplifies the question, so what was wrong with that? That's exactly what they wanted. They wanted to touch heaven. What's the problem? Well, let's go back to Jimi Hendrix as a case study. What happened with him? He may have touched the sky, but he never came back to tell about it. Unfortunately, he overdosed in his mid-20s. What was it, 24? 27, okay. The ripe age of 27, tragically. As did many of his contemporaries. Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin. The list goes on. Great geniuses. And you think about it, I was always taken by these people, and they generally capture people's imagination. You know, what was going on? What was going on is a very simple and tragic reality. They were geniuses, and they were desperate to touch the sky, but they didn't have the tools. They didn't know how to return. And that's what happens when a person is very thirsty, drinks too fast. So the drive in them was a very healthy one. Actually, it was, as I said, brilliant. But transcendence is a double-edged sword. It has power. And like all power, if it's not channeled, can become destructive. Think of anything of power in life. What has power? Fire has power. What about fire? Is fire a good thing or a bad thing? The answer is how it's used and whether it's contained. Without fire, we have no warmth, we have no life, we have no heat. Without the sun, we have no light, and so on. But on the other hand, if the sun was just a few miles closer to Earth, everything would burn up ultimately. A fire that's not contained destroys and annihilates. A very frightening force. Same with water. Water, of course, sustains life, the nourishment of life. Without water, nothing can grow. Our bodies are over 70% water. The earth is almost 70, is 2/3 water, and so on. But water, uncontained, becomes a tsunami, becomes a flood, can destroy. Anyone that owns a home knows quite well. The same water that you must have, if it starts leaking in the wrong places, it can destroy foundations. Yeah, it seems very innocent. But just Rabbi Akiva can teach us that a drop after drop of water can pierce a stone in a good way. Drops and drops of water going the wrong place can also destroy. So everything of force has unbelievable power. Knowledge is the most powerful force. And look what happens with knowledge. If it's not directed and it's lacking humility, it becomes the worst force possible. I think it was the Sufis that say, a knowledge does not help you transcend yourself is worse than ignorance. Because then it becomes a force that helps you become more arrogant. And then now you're empowered also with knowledge. Look at the Nazis, what they did with knowledge and science. And they were not considered a third world country, primitive, etc., etc. They were a sophisticated country with philosophy and medicine and biology and breakthroughs. But when it's lacking humility, it's lacking accountability to a higher sense of morality, knowledge in the hands of the wrong person becomes the most destructive possible force. An ignorant person can never accomplish such efficiency in killing people. So everything of power always has two sides to it. And so the story, when you really start reading it, is really the two sides on the search for transcendence. So the fact that they were searching for transcendence is great. That's why we're told the story. But then, of course, the same sentence says they searched for transcendence to make a name for themselves. And that's the problem. So as I asked earlier, what's wrong with making a name for yourself? Okay, listen, it's not the best thing to be arrogant. Obviously, arrogance is not a virtue. But is it really destructive? Yes. In the hands of a transcendent person, it's very destructive. Everybody can be forgiven for having an ego. But if your ego comes together with your power, and the power is used to build ego, that is potential for worse disasters, much worse than any crime. Because then you justify it all. Think of it this way. Who are the most destructive people in life? Are the ones that are the smartest people. In the Bible, in the Torah later, there's a sentence that says, Hasheichid ya'aver einei chachamim, which means bribery, bias, blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts the tongue of the righteous. So the question is asked, if they can blind the eyes of the person or distort his tongue, he's not that wise, he's not that righteous. Why is the Torah call a person wise and righteous? Because the answer is that's precisely the power of bias. Bias is not in the domain only of the fools and of the wicked. Everyone can be biased. Moses himself recuses himself in certain situations when it was dealing with his brother or family member. You can think Moses, the humblest man that ever walked on earth, a godly man. He couldn't be objective, but he knew. Bottom line is, Aaron is my flesh brother, my blood, my flesh and blood. And therefore, ultimately, I cannot trust myself because I don't know where I'll be biased. Remember, bias doesn't mean that you're aware of it. It's like I remember dealing with this situation, and it was a whole situation. Somebody involved was a very smart rabbi that I knew and a very big scholar, but it was his nephew that this story was about. So I said to him, I think you shouldn't be involved in this because it's your nephew. So he says, so I told him, because it's your nephew, you're biased. He says, yeah, but I know I'm biased, so therefore I can counter it. So I told him, yeah, it's like the guy that says, when you ask him, do you have any blind spots? He says, yeah, but I know what they are. It doesn't work that way. A blind spot means you don't know. You're blind to the blind spot also. That's why you need another person's advice. And it's like the doctor that says, I'll tell you when you need a second opinion. You know? You get the point. That's exactly why I need a second opinion, because I don't want you to tell me when I need it. I want to go and see whether your opinion is correct. If you're telling me when you need a second opinion, it's not what I'm looking for. So we all have the ability to be blind, and we all have our blind spots. That's the reality. I know they're trying to figure out technology to find some type of rear view mirror in the car that covers the blind spot that everybody has, the back right of the car. And I think they figured something out. But, even if they do, that's just a technical blind spot. But psychologically, emotionally, we all have blind spots. It's impossible not to have one. That's what makes us human. A wise person knows that. A wise person also knows that he may not know where the blind spot is, and therefore has to subject himself to an accountability and have someone else give advice. This is why we go to advisors. Why do we go to consultants? Why we go to try to get objective opinions. Even though I know people who spend a lot of money getting objective opinion and not listening, I guess they feel good that at least they asked. But that's another story, because we don't always want to hear what they tell us. Accountants will tell you that the worst enemy of an accountant is his client, because he doesn't always want to hear at the end of the year all the mistakes he made. And even if you tell it, but anyway, to go back to this theme here, so the problem here is not, so the point here the Torah is telling us is the fact that they want to make a name for themselves. If that was the only crime, that would be that's the nature of human beings. People want to make names for themselves. People create monuments, plaques, honor themselves. I mean, you see this all the time. Some people have most of their lives just for kavod, as they say, for honor. But that's not what the sentence is saying. It's saying they went to build a tower that touched the sky. And when you want to go into transcendence, then arrogance is no longer just an innocuous, just a innocent force, or just a necessary evil. Then it becomes dangerous. And I'll explain why in another story later in the Torah. You have the story of the two sons of Aaron. The two sons of Aaron we read the story at Yom Kippur, every Yom Kippur in the Torah reading, because it's a Yom Kippur story. So the temple, the Torah tells us the holy temple is the sanctuary was built. And now the first day of service. So these two great men, they're called Nadav and Avihu, two sons of Aaron, in their great ecstasy, passion, and search for transcendence, they couldn't wait for that day when the temple would be finished, because then they can go in and in some way connect to God, to kiss the sky. That's what they wanted. So it says they went in, but because they didn't go unprepared, they were maybe too enthusiastic, the Torah says a strange fire came and consumed them. It's interesting. Another example of actual burnout. They're the first people who burned out. They burned, literally, the Torah says they burned out. And then you have another story. The story in the Talmud of 4 people who decided to go into the Pardes, the garden, or the orchard. And this is always a orchard in Torah. Pardes is always a metaphor for a mystical experience, a spiritual experience. And it says that the 4, each one of them, except one, came out wounded. One died out of simple, overwhelmed, similar to overdose. Overwhelmed by the experience. He saw too much light. It's like looking at the sun without sunglasses. The second one went mad, similar reason. The third one became an apostate, an unbeliever, because he was confused by what he saw. And the fourth, Rabbi Akiva, it says, entered in peace and left in peace, because he went in with humility. When it comes to entering the Holy of Holies, which in modern lingo means experience of transcendence, of real profound intimacy or love, which I'll soon discuss a little more about, that's where it's not simple whether you're building a name for yourself. If you build your name for yourself, it's destructive. There, humility is a necessity, not an option. And to just explain it in the context of, let's say, what they call the Jewish relativity theory. This is a Jewish joke. That 3 hairs on your head may be very little. But I can tell you that. And but 3 hairs in the soup, that's the Jewish relativity theory. So it all depends, the context. If a piece of dust is on your finger, it doesn't disturb anyone. A piece of dust on your eyeball is a major irritant. God forbid the same bacteria that don't enter our bodies and don't infect us, because we have layers of skin and hair and all the things that protect from infection, from toxic infections and so on. God forbid in surgery, the room has to be extremely sterilized in order to protect, because once the internal organs are open, there every piece of bacteria is much more destructive, because they go for where there's nourishment. So the bottom line is, the more sensitive the area you enter, the more subtle and the more careful care has to be taken to enter into that place. So in human life, what is the Holy of Holies? We don't have a temple right now. What's the Holy of Holies in the soul? It's your sexuality. It's intimacy. Sexuality is a mystery and will always remain a mystery in a person's life, like love itself, precisely because it's not of this world. As soon as we try, as I said before with the net, we try to apply the tools of our conventional tools, you cannot bottle love. You cannot replicate it. You can't purchase it. And you can't sell it. Sexuality is not just technique, and it's not just a physical experience. It's an emotional and a spiritual experience. In a Torah context, sexuality is considered like going into the Holy of Holies. Actually, the word for sexuality in the Torah, you'd be interested, is, you know what it's called? It's called knowledge, to know. It says Adam knew Eve. That refers to having an intimate experience with Eve. Knowledge is much more than just a physical interaction. It means two souls get to know each other in a place that is beyond the regular experiences that we experience on a daily basis. And that is why in that area, you have, like fire, I mentioned, can be the source of greatest passion and the source of the greatest destruction. And God forbid, when there's abuse in the sexual area, in intimacy, that's the worst of all abuses. Because it's going into the area of a person's most deepest vulnerable space. Like I said before, like the eyeball or the internal organs. And there, when something happens, it's not just a little thing. Every little thing is a big thing. Children, for example, before they've developed their defense mechanisms, are very much also compared sometimes to the Holy of Holies. That's why when a child experiences something strong, traumatic, it can have a permanent, almost permanent impact. When we adults have enough defenses, so someone hurts you or someone insults you, you have ways to protect yourself. But an innocent child does not. So think of it like a seed. If you make a little scratch on a tree, on a big tree, it's very insignificant. Try to make a scratch on a seed, what will happen? Besides the fact that it may destroy the seed and the seed can never grow, but even if it does grow, that little scratch, and this has been proven in laboratories, can turn into a major distortion of the tree as it grows larger, because everything is microscopic. It's like a fetus. Things that happen in the fetal stage, every little detail matters. A child, a moment of conception is the size of less than of a nail. But it doesn't mean there's no life there. It just means it's all concentrated. And whenever it's concentrated, every little thing takes on whole new proportions. So what happens here in this story, to go back to this, their search for transcendence is absolutely a virtue. They were looking to kiss heaven. I mean, there are different opinions. Some say they wanted to go to war with God. But that was also part of arrogance. The actual idea of transcending and touching heaven, that's a virtue. That is the mission of life. However, it's how you go and how you enter this journey. They entered with building a name for themselves. Building a name for themselves, which is why they basically said, why would they want to go to war with God? If you're a human being, you can build a tower to heaven and touch heaven. You'd want to be an ally with God. Why would they have to go to war with God? Because it's either you or God. That's what an ego is all about. The Talmud says a very interesting statement, that God says, I, God, and an arrogant person cannot coexist under the same canopy. There's no room for both of us. They say that there's some gurus or teachers, masters, when you come to see them, they ask you, the custom is that you have to bring a cup of water. First time you come to meet a certain Eastern gurus, you come with a cup of water. So usually most people think, why do you come with a cup of water? To show a certain type of respect. This is your teacher, you're like bringing them, you're serving them. So you're serving your teacher by bringing them a cup of water. Well, this student comes, and that's what he thinks he's doing. He's so proud of himself. He brings his cup of water, and he gives it to the teacher, to the master. The master takes the cup and turns it over and spills it out on the ground. So then he thinks, okay, I guess he has to, humiliate me. That's also part of this process. No, then the master says to him, look, take this cup. Come back like this cup now, and then we'll talk. The message was not the humiliation, not even serving. It was about, you have to come empty. You cannot come full. Now this is like a very simple lesson, and why would it take so much to teach someone? But it's not so simple. As simple as we understand it is, the fact is we are filled and inflated with our own selves, and that's the first enemy to any growth, your self. And I want to qualify this. This does not mean annihilating the self is the solution, because ultimately the goal is that your self be there, but it has to be empty and be ready to absorb something greater than yourself. It's the secret to all real growth, the ability to listen to another perspective. If a person is not ready to do that, I'm not saying you have to listen to every perspective, and every perspective may not be right. But if you're not open to another perspective, then as great as you are, you're trapped in your own cup. You're trapped in your own being. And here, this was the thing. If they were really searching for transcendence, then their goal would have been to reach God and connect with God. The reason they went to war with God, because they were talking about themselves. This was about me. It was like being I want to have another perfect thing on my resume. I have this, I have that, now I want transcendence. And spirituality and the search for transcendence, by definition, means to transcend yourself, not to be more of yourself. That's why you have the concept of spiritual arrogance. Anyone hears that first, they think, 1 second, spirituality is supposed to be humble. No, you find spiritually arrogant people. You see them all the time. They're arrogant, they feel superior to those that are not spiritual. In Judaism, there's a step above spirituality. Yes, a material human being may be selfish and interested in material acquisition and material growth. A spiritual person perhaps can transcend that, but spirituality could also be another acquisition. You're searching to be spiritual. You want that to be complete on that level as well. And in Judaism, there's a third level, God. God is neither spiritual nor material, and that is why in Jewish mysticism, the fusion of matter and spirit is critical. It's not just about transcending the material world and reaching to a spiritual state of being. It's about returning and building a life on this world. There were many great mystics in history, many, and great philosophers. Maybe the greatest of all philosophers, Aristotle himself. Others, you have Confucius, you have Buddha, but not one of them, interestingly, claims, no one on this earth today claims to be a direct descendant or grandchild of any of these people. The Dalai Lama is considered to be a reincarnation, but I'm talking about a flesh and blood descendant. With Jews, you find an interesting phenomenon. We have great mystics and great teachers, and we claim that they're our ancestors. Children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We knew where they walked, who their children were, and we know the exact lineage all the way from them to today. I once discussed this with a Buddhist monk that I know. I asked him this question. I didn't mean to be critical or judgmental or pull rank. I just wanted to hear his take on it. And he said to me, well, mysticism and spirituality really counters the idea of building a family. So I said, so you mean to say it's not an objective to build a family? He said, no, it's objective, but it's not as important as the mystical journey. And he hit the nail right on the head. He's absolutely right. His mysticism, which I don't take away from, ends up being about me. And in Judaism, it is ultimately a real paradox. Because the mystical journey, as what happened to Hendrix and to all these people, ultimately, they were overcome by their own selfishness, to be very honest, blunt. Not selfishness, not maybe the pursuit for money, the pursuit for soul. Until they overdosed. What do you think? Drugs, they like drugs? It was not the drug, it was the high. It was entering, they wanted the high. But I wanted the high. As soon as it's me wanting a high, it's like a guy pursuing heaven, but to make a name for himself. And the counterforce to the powerful tug of heaven and transcendence is a certain type of humility. No, but you have to return now and build a family. Abraham was an unbelievable mystic. If you read some of Abraham's statements, maybe the first of them all, he was a pioneer. Considered the father of all religions. Christianity, Islam, even in the Far East, Brahman and other Buddhist concepts are attributed to Abraham. And yet, what did Abraham say? We'll read it next week's chapter. That I commit to you, God, and I will build a family and children that will pursue the path of virtue. You don't find that in mystics' books. You find great insights into the world of spirit and the world of a higher unity and powerful stuff. But to return and leave the Holy of Holies and go out of it and back to a mundane life, which is monotonous and boring and domestic, and infuse that with the high that you achieved, that requires something that's far beyond spirituality. That requires real humility, what's called bittul, the transcendence of your own transcendence. In other words, they tell the story of one of the great mystics. His name was Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He lived in the 19th century. And one of his greatest disciples was a brilliant mystic and scholar on every possible level. And that's what he did. He taught, and he was humble and dedicated to his work. One day, his teacher calls him in and says to him, I have a mission for you. Okay, he's ready to do anything. Well, wait till he heard what the mission was. It wasn't so simple. He says, I want you to become what's called in those days a balagola. A balagola is basically a wagon driver. The equivalent today of a cab driver. A wagon driver. Then there were horses and wagons, and you drove people. And the student looked at his teacher and said, he almost thought maybe he meant somebody else. And not because he was arrogant. It was just not, is that the best use of his time? He can teach, he can write, he can inspire. And the Alter Rebbe his teacher tells him, no, I mean you and you. Now, of course, this was a great enough student to understand that if that's what he's being told, that's what you do. And that's what he did for 20 years. He left his post as a teacher, as a master. And again, it wasn't because he was very arrogant about his work. But this was the real test. Are you doing it because of you, or are you doing it because the cause demands it? And if God says to you, I don't want you to be right now spiritual, I want you to go build a family, or I want you to go bend down and diaper a child, is that beneath your dignity? It's not spiritual enough? And if you can't do that, then you are trapped just like anyone else is trapped. So ultimate transcendence is even being able to transcend your need to transcend. And that's the ultimate real story here. And that's why we're told the story. Why do we have to be told this? Listen, they made a mistake. They were, then the gods scattered them across the world. Why do we need to know the story? After the fact, it's over. The story's over. Because we need to know about what they did and what they wanted to do. It's not like what they did was wrong per se. Their search was correct. The way they did it was wrong. And that's exactly what happens here. So this now explains also the end of the story. This whole confusion thing. Why didn't God just destroy the tower? He could have found many ways to destroy it, because that was not the point. Of course God could destroy the tower. That's not no achievement. The point was that if you want to really be united with each other, you can't do so and also make a name for yourself, because ultimately you will destroy each other. It's cause and effect. God was not punishing them. God was giving them, just speeding up the process of what they called upon themselves. Because what's the next step? Let's say they would build a tower, and they would have made a name for themselves. Remember that. Then the next argument would be, well, who's got the name on top? Who's the leader? Who's the biggest name? And they would begin to argue, who's the leader here? And of course, every argument leads to more conflicts, because they were not driven by humility. So God was saying to them, look what they do. They're united. They speak the same language. Today they're united to build a tower, to be transcendent, but they're doing it for their own selfish purposes. And tomorrow they won't be. So God said, look, you bring upon yourself this divisiveness, confuse the languages, and one day learn how to speak with humility to each other. And even though you may speak different languages, you'll be united again. And this time you'll be able to kiss heaven and come back to tell and return to tell about it. So you have here an unbelievable story about really the story of history of all of us. Because each of us can take lessons from this in different ways. Maybe it's not called transcendence, it's a search for love. And it's very paradoxical, because on one hand you want it, and there's nothing wrong with that wanting. But the more you want it, the more humble you have to be to enter. Later you have Jacob says an unbelievable statement after he was saved from his enemies. He says this thing, he says, Katenti mekolach sodim, he says to God, I've been humbled by all the graciousness that you've done for me. It's one of the most classic statements ever said, because usually people pray to God when things aren't working, when things aren't going well. Here's a man who was just blessed with the greatest miracles, and he did not forget. I was recently visited a friend in a hospital. He was on his deathbed already. He made it, so he's alive, so that's the good news. But here's the bad news. So the good news, so he was in the hospital, and he was a person who's, I know, many years. He has many, many strengths and talents, but he's in this category. He's transcendent and he's spiritual, but it's all about him. And therefore, everybody who's ever been close to him has been hurt in the process, obviously. Relationship, marriage, children. And I know him, I see his strengths, and he's done a lot of good things for people, don't get me wrong, but this is the thing. He's lying in the hospital, and he's really not well. And he tells me, he's not stupid, he knows his life. He acknowledges all that, his own selfishness and narcissism. And this is like, you could say, well, he's doing that because he's about to die. And he was, the doctors had given up. I said to him, well, what happens if God saves you? Will you remember what you said now? He says, absolutely, how could you forget? I'm at my deathbed. It doesn't get worse than this. Well, how do you like this? God was kind to him, and he did forget. And I remind him, trust me, and not because I'm a cruel guy, but he needs to be reminded from time to time. I don't call him every day about it, but I saw literally, I said to him, explain this to me. You were there at a place where you almost were gone, and you returned, and you still, you just went right back to your own world. He says, well, that's the darkness of this life, etc., etc. And he has a philosophical explanation. He blames it on God, actually, because God conceals his presence. That's why you find, when you hear a story with Jacob, that he said, I was humbled by all the goodness, and he remembered it. His whole life was changed when in the face of goodness, not in the face of trauma, where you're desperate, and you're ready to do anything, I make a deal with God. Like the guy that's driving around the block and says, I praise to God, if you find me a parking place, I'll give charity. And then suddenly a parking place opens up, he says, forget it. That type of deal. So the story of transcendence, the story of what really we look for in life. And this really is the lesson. We all have things we look for, deep things. And I see this all the time. It's very painful to see. You see people searching for something, and they deserve it. And they're searching for the right thing, but they are their own worst enemy. Because it becomes too much about them. I want it. You have a story later in the Bible, also a similar story. I mentioned this many times here. Moses is standing with God. This is also connected to Yom Kippur, which, by the way, is the holiest day of the year and the most intimate day. That's why these narratives are all relevant to that day. So Moses says to God suddenly, show me your glory, show me your face, show me your glory. And God responds, no man can see me and live. It's also a classic story. And then it continues. God says to him, but I'll show you my back. However, my face you will not see. So the obvious question is this. Why does God have to rub it in? He already said no man can see me and live. And now he says, I'll show you my back. Why do you have to add and say, my face you will not see? He already said it. And then the second question is, what was Moses thinking? He was a profound man. What does he think? You could see the face of God. Like the philosophers say that if you knew God, you would be God. There's a reality that if you experience face to face, you become it, and it's no longer you. It's it. Moses, of course, understood that. Yet he still asked. So one very powerful commentator explains as follows. Really powerful explanation that is so relevant in this context. He says the way you're supposed to read the verse is not the way I just read it. The comma in the second sentence has to be placed in a different place. And it has to be read like this. God says, no man can see me and live. Okay. Then he says, but I will show you my back. So usually we read, I will show you my back, comma, but my face you will not see. This commentator says, no, you're supposed to read like this. I will show you my back and my face, but my face you will not see by looking at it. In other words, the comma comes after you will not see. You will see it by not seeing it. There are things in life that we can see directly, and we can grasp, and we can comprehend, and we can contain. And there are things in life that the only time you will ever experience is when you stop looking, and you stop trying to hold on to it. Anything in the nature of intimacy is in that category. As soon as you think you own it, you lose possession. As soon as you feel you don't, you acquire it. And it's not something that you can play games with. That's how it is. It's the nature of the beast. It's the nature of the experience. Because God was saying to him, you cannot see me and live you. If you want to be you and see me, it's not going to be. You can see my back, you can see my reflection, you can see a manifestation of me, but my essence and your essence, the essence of reality cannot be seen by something. You have to become it. But then God says to him as a gift, he says, I'll show you directly my back, but my face I will show you, but you have to not look. Stop looking for it and it will emerge. So there are things that we acquire and there are things that emerge. I mentioned at the beginning of this class about truth. Real truth emerges. I don't care how much they want for it. Truth cannot be acquired. It has to be emerge. You can acquire tools that help you get rid of the blocks that allow the truth to emerge. But the truth has to be something within you. Think of music. Can somebody in some way touch you with a piece of music if it doesn't resonate with you? They can't force it into you. You can't feed somebody music with IV, for example, or something like that. You know, there are things you just cannot, you have to touch the person. There's an expression, words from the heart enter the heart. Words from the brain, from the mind, enter one ear and go out the other. When someone wants to reach a heart, there's no way you can reach a heart by using your brain. Look at it this way. If somebody, God forbid, suffers a great tragedy, is there any philosophy in the world and any rationalization that can speak to a bleeding heart? It's ridiculous. A mind, the most brilliant mind, cannot speak to a wounded heart. It doesn't work that way. A heart does not understand intellect. A heart understands a heart. Like one great Rebbe said to a person who suffered a great tragedy, he said, I have no answers for you, but I can cry with you. And later that person said that crying with him was better than any answer he'd ever get. Because it was the empathy, it was the care. Someone holds your hand when you're in a weak place. It's more powerful than any explanation. So the mind has its role. You know, it processes, but it's like a computer. The smart computer is going to console a human being that is hurt. You know, maybe they'll create some type of virtual computer that knows what to say, or knows how to cry even. You have dolls that cry, right? Yeah. But the point I'm making here is that there are realities, there are truths in a person's life that can only be experienced through emerging, not through being acquired. And love is in that category, intimacy is in that category, and transcendence is in that category. You can get a simulated version of it. You know, God forbid, for example, prostitution is also a form of sexuality, but it's not love. So you have the technical part of it, the body part, and you can buy it, but that's not buying love. That's buying an act. I mean, just to use an example. Same thing with transcendence. You know, we have all kinds of gimmicks and tricks. The fact is, for example, one of the reasons the Torah abhors any type of foreign substance to achieve any state of transcendence is because ultimately you haven't earned your right. You're using something to induce it, as opposed to earn your right to enter that place. The sons of Aaron, just as other stories of transcendence, went in with good intentions, but they did not go in prepared. They did not go in with the right humility. You can't force your way into truth. You may have a taste of it, and there's no question, I have met people, many people, who told me clearly they discovered God through LSD. I remember in this class even, someone coming in once pretty high on something or other, and then he asked me, like he was very loud and very vocal, and it was at the end of the class, and he said, and he told his story. He said, I want to ask a question. His question was, he says, I grew up in a traditional Jewish home. I used to put on tefillin. I kept Shabbos, kosher. And when I was a teenager, I left it all. And I discovered God, he said, through LSD and through other psychedelic experiences in California and so on. And once I was flying back from East Coast to West Coast, or the other way around, and the back of the plane, there were a bunch of Orthodox Jews who were davening. They were praying. They had a minyan in the back there, and they were wrapping the tefillin. And he said, I was on a trip, not on a plane trip only, and as I heard them saying the prayer, Kaddish, 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 I jumped up because I sensed the celestial angels, and I looked out and I saw the clouds vibrating and sound like a rainbow coming through the windows. He described his whole, all his surroundings. Basically, his senses were alive, as they say. Okay, and I jumped up. I went to the back of the plane, and I joined them, and I put on tefillin for the first time again after many years. This is also he was saying that wasn't in this room. It was in 81st Street when I was teaching there. So let me ask you, says. So after that, I decided to re-enter into my Jewish commitment, and today I keep Shabbos and I eat kosher. And all because of the LSD. I would never have re-embraced it. So what's your opinion on that? That's what he asked me. So, and there were a lot of people in the class. Everybody was interested to hear what I'm going to say about this. What am I supposed to say? Pretty catch-22 here. So I said, look, I'm not, I don't work in the hashgacha business, the kashrut hashgacha business. There's OU and OK and all these different, they give, kashrut endorsements. So I'm not about to give you you should go to the OU, maybe they'll give you OU on LSD or something. But I will say the following. This is what I told them, and this is what I believe. I said, let me give you another example. An example, let's say somebody, God forbid, falls into a coma. And doctors try everything, nothing works. And the person is just vegetating and afraid of atrophy. His whole being is deteriorating. And then finally one doctor says, let's try a massive dose of drugs just to shake up the system. That you would never give a healthy person because it can kill somebody. But here, there's nothing to lose. He's in a vegetable state, practically, comatose. And they give the drugs, they inject him with these drugs, and it shakes up his system and he comes out of the coma. So what do you think? What would you suggest? That you start giving everybody these massive drugs? I say the following. We live in a world where many people are in a spiritual coma, and it could very well be the hollow and mechanical Judaism you experienced turned you off. And it was God in his mysterious ways planted, I guess, in strange places, reminders that you can have a transcendent experience. So I'm not suggesting that your transcendence that you experienced through LSD was not real, but it was a person in a coma, desperate, and it satisfied you. But now that you know, now you should teach people how to access it without the need for a foreign injection or a foreign substance. And that's my approach. So we don't invalidate how you got to this place, but that doesn't necessarily endorse this approach, because if you can find the same spiritual transcendence without it, obviously it's a lot healthier. And in a strange way, in his case it worked, but in a strange way, it ultimately you have to earn your right to get to that place. You have to earn your right. And that's ultimately the story here, what God is telling them about this tower that they built to build a name for themselves. So the transcendence is a healthy search. The unity is healthy. The problem is that they, as usual, people with power, people with seeking something great, were lacking humility. And that lack of humility is the undoing of it all. That cannot be. You will not touch heaven if you think you're coming with all your strengths. When you're ready to suspend yourself and you're ready to say, as God told Moses, don't look, that's when you enter heaven. You can't enter heaven on your terms. It's going to be on God's terms, not on your terms. And basically, it cannot be you and your ego, because then we run the risk of becoming another ego trip, another selfish experience. And I mentioned before, Nazi Germany, as grotesque and as obscene as it is, and you read and you hear some of the writings, and I've read plenty of their writings and scientific justification for the genocides and so on and so forth. And if you step back from the idea of sanctity of life and just say, hey, maybe some people on earth are bacteria and need to be exterminated. God forbid, that's not what I'm trying to argue. If you go purely with the mind and philosophy and science and medicine, yeah, you can turn anything. I mean, just like we step on ants all the time and we're killing millions of bacteria every second, maybe part of the human race has also been contaminated, which was a justification that they kept on hammering away and finally began to resonate with some people in Germany. More than just some. Because there are people who are directly involved and there are people who are complicit. But the point is that the deeper meaning is what was lacking is the element of humility. That the more you know, the more humble you have to become. The greater your achievements, the greater the science. If you don't have humility, it can lead to the worst. I'm just giving one example, but even though here it didn't lead to the worst, but had the tower been built and had they achieved their goals, they would have become worse than any criminal, worse than the flood, the generation of the flood, because they were powerful. They knew what transcendence was, and anyone that has such power can be extremely dangerous. Look at it even today, legally speaking. For example, if a therapist abuses a client, or a doctor abuses a client, or a teacher abuses a student, it's considered far worse than when it's just two peers or two adults or something like that. Why? Because there's trust. Because this person has power over the other person. You're a teacher, you're a therapist, your person's opening themselves up to you. You're vulnerable. So whenever there's great power, there always has to be that great humility. Now this is a lesson that you don't have to come here to hear. Everybody talks about it. But in the Torah context, here's perhaps the first story where you actually have the story of search for transcendence and all the consequences that come out of it. So on a concluding note, what I would say is the following. We all have very powerful desires and aspirations. We all have the right and deserve to have the most love, intimacy, truth, transcendence in our lives. And the way to actually enter there is the more you apply the lesson of humility, of not doing it your way, and opening yourself up to hear another perspective, the more likelihood is you'll get what you want in your life. And I say this because I know many people, New York is the mecca of single life, a lot of singles here. And we live in a society, and media, and television, and so on, continues to reinforce the myth that if you don't go out and get it, no one's going to do it for you. Yes, that's very true when it comes to getting a job or some other material pursuits, but it's not true when it comes to love. Yes, it doesn't mean you should stay in a basement and lock yourself up. You have to go out and be aggressive, but not aggressive in the sense of going out and getting it, but not aggressive in the relationship. In a relationship, it's what humility, subtlety is the key to every healthy relationship. And it's not an art that we're taught. It's an art that you either acquire often in your own childhood as you pick it up from your parents, and often we don't pick it up from our parents, and then it gets more and more difficult to do. So it's really not the scope of this discussion this evening of how one achieves it, but clearly if something's not working, it's time to get another opinion, and not a second opinion. A real other opinion that challenges you. As I always say, it's always great to have a good friend, a trusting friend, that you invite to kick you in your pants, if you know what I mean. You invite them to challenge you, because that's often where salvation comes. Someone challenging your assumptions, your perspectives, your approach. And what do you have to lose? You have a lot to gain, because you open yourself up to another approach. We live in a world where comfort zones are very powerful, though there's a recession and so on, but relative to our parents and grandparents, this is a prosperous time. Prosperous, I don't just mean financially, I mean in freedoms, in luxuries. Today, basically, I mean everything is available. You don't have to struggle for so many things that we don't have to struggle. But in a strange way, we struggle for the most difficult, the most important thing of all, relationships. So the more our material prosperity grows and our options, like a guy told me, he's so proud of himself that he got himself, he's a geek So he got himself like 5 televisions, and he's able to go through 6,000 cable stations every night or something. I don't know. And this is his big achievement. Now, when I ask him, so what do you think about getting married and settling down? He has no time. He's got too many stations to go through. I mean, he doesn't say it exactly those words, but it's more or less as pathetic as that. And so it's interesting. Our freedoms, our options, are they enslaving us or are they freeing us? Are we more emancipated? So these are questions that we can all ask ourselves. And the story in the Bible here has many lessons and in life. We live, as I said, in a life of ease and comfort, and now it's becoming mobile as well. So you really don't have to go anywhere to access any information anytime. You can entertain yourself all the time. But the soul is gnawing, is hungry, and it will not let anyone rest. Unfortunately, many of us numb that search or that pain by through whatever, painkillers, physical or spiritual or metaphorical. And we numb ourselves from not having to feel that emptiness. But that soul inside beckons and will have its day. And it will keep making you crazy. The Kabbalists like to say anxiety is your soul telling you something's wrong. It speaks to you. It speaks to you through anxiety. It speaks to you through hunger, through existential loneliness, through other voices. And the way you satisfy the soul is not how you satisfy the body. The body, you consume some food, some drink, some exercise, some other things that keep the body going. The soul has to be fed like you feed a child. It's through nurturing. It's through love. It's through acceptance. It's actually not through, as I said, acquiring. It's through emergence. It's through things that are absorbed, not that are transmitted. So may God bless us all to refine or fine-tune our absorbing tools, the ability to listen, the ability to resonate, and the ability to allow the deeper truths to emerge from our intimate souls. And God bless everyone in fulfilling all your dreams. And the day comes when you want to see God's face. Remember, you could see it, but you have to look the other way. I want to thank everybody very much for this, for being here. And I want to make a few announcements. Philip's class will be tomorrow. I think he said to me the topic is 7 p.m. tomorrow evening, which is called Transforming What We Know, right, into Action. That's the topic of the class. Is there a dedication for the class? Okay, thank you. Very interesting dedication. This class is in honor of the engagement of Mushka Jacobson to Mendy Boimmelgreen. May they have a happy life together. Mushka Jacobson is both my niece and one of our administrator. Okay. Yeah, Mushka is the person that works there, right? In our office, she's at the office end of things, very efficient, and we congratulate her for her engagement. And she'll be getting married later this year, at the middle of December. And if you haven't left your email address, as I said in my story earlier, today email is a good way to stay connected. So please do so. I'll be happy to send you the weekly email I send out. And you feel free to challenge it or rebut it or agree or not agree as you see fit. And anything else I missed? We'll be here next Wednesday, and we also send out a Wednesday email about the updates of what goes on, the topics of the class, and if there are any last-minute changes and stuff like that. And please see me and Velvel, and all of us at the Meaningful Life Center as allies, as kindred spirits in this journey of life, which is not just spiritual but also transcendent. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.